Good evening. Welcome to another episode of the Ari Lewis Show here on IsraelSportsandNewsRadio.com. This is also going to be uploaded to YouTube as well. Bezrat Hashem. We'll see what happens. The Nation of Israel YouTube channel. Check it out. And we'll put it on our Rumble page as well. Any comments, questions, concerns, or complaints. It is a Jewish country after all. You can email us here at arilewishow@hotmail.com. My guest this evening is the founder and the head of the Shiloh Institute. It's a great pleasure to help on the program. Rabbi David Bar Chayim, thank you for being on the program.
Shalom, and my pleasure to be here.
Absolutely. So, of course, Tisha B'Av is upon us. That'll be this Moshe Shabbat. And there's a lot of different customs that pertain not only to Tisha B'Av, but the days and weeks preceding Tisha B'Av as well. And I wanted to know if you could explain to our audience some of the origins of those customs, such as 3 weeks before. There are a lot of Ashkenazim that won't shave. I'm doing that right now. Some won't have meat 9 days before. Some won't listen to live music. Some won't listen to tape music, etc. If you can give us a background of the origins of the customs and how they differ from the Ashkenazi world, Sephardi world, and other places as well.
Well, I'll begin with one example, and then you mention to me whatever other examples you wish me to cover. Let us take first of all the concept of the 3 weeks, Shloshet HaShavuot. Simply put, in the Mishnah and the Talmud, Hazal never heard of such a concept. There is no such concept of 3 weeks. What the Mishnah discusses is Mishenichnas Av Mema'atim B'Simcha, which means from the beginning of the month of Av, which is 9 days before Tisha B'Av, and whether Rosh Chodesh is actually included in that or not is an interesting point. Whether it should be considered to be included in that or not, that's an interesting point also. But from the beginning of the month of Av, which is just over a week before Tisha B'Av, we are instructed by the Mishnah, L'ma'et b'simcha, which means to refrain from doing certain activities, pleasurable, fun activities. There are various examples which the Talmud discusses, such as what was common in those days was that when a man's son was about to get married, they would add a room to the family or the tribe, the hamula. They would add a room to the house in which the son and his prospective bride would live, at least for some time before they actually went off, perhaps set up their own home somewhere else. But certainly for a time they would live with his parents, and that's called a Beth Hathanuth. In other words, building the house for the married couple. Now that's a happy occasion. So, and building that room for them, or that house for them, is a happy event, something which engenders rejoicing, etc., which is not appropriate at this time. So that is not something that you do during those first few days of the month of Av. That's one example. I can give you an example from this morning. I received a phone call from a certain woman, God-fearing, fine individual, and she said, I have 2 sons, one 9 years old, one 7 years old, who are taught by a certain young rabbi we have who comes and teaches them Torah every day. They're homeschooled, and he suggested taking them swimming today. Is that correct? Is that proper? And I said, no, it's not proper. They should not go swimming today. They're old enough to understand. They're not 3, not 4 years old. They're 7 and 9 years old. They're old enough to understand what we call usually gil hinuch, the age from which a child can be instructed and given to understand certain things. They can understand why they cannot go swimming at this point in time. Swimming it's not bathing. Swimming, that's for fun. It's for enjoyment. It's not hygiene. It's not to wash off the grime and the sweat. It's just have a good time. That is not something that you do during the first 9 days of the month of Av. And that's what I told her. And she said, okay, fine, thank you. And that was it. And another example, now this is a different example. Listening to music. This is again something not mentioned by Hazal in the Mishnah and the Talmud at all. It's also not mentioned by the Rishonim, by the way, I should point out, by the medieval halachic decisors and sages. Why? For the obvious reason, they did not have tape recorders, CDs, records, YouTube, disc on keys, what have you. They didn't have any of these things. Music was always something that was played live, and it was always, or almost always, associated with some celebration, a wedding or some other such event. That's music, therefore, naturally went together with happy, festive occasions. And that is why it's not discussed, because it was obvious you don't have weddings and you don't have such gatherings. So music, how is music going to enter into the home in ancient times? Nowadays, we live in a different world where you can switch on music anytime you like, at home, when you're working in the kitchen, when you're driving in your car, when you're commuting to work, whatever it might be. And music is more readily available. Many of us are used to listening to music on a regular basis. And that's why the question comes up. And it's mentioned for the first time in latter-day Poskim, like the Magen Avraham, 350 odd years ago, about Jewish musicians who play at weddings. And at this time it would be Jewish musicians in places like Poland, where he came from, where they would be playing at non-Jewish weddings. That was their parnasah, that was their livelihood. Are they able to do so? Are they not able to do so? That's discussed. But it's not discussed before that time, because music was always something that was live, and something was associated with a happy occasion, rejoicing, and merriment of some kind. So my view on this for many years has been that, first of all, I mentioned before, I return to my initial point, the concept of 3 weeks is an Ashkenazim minhag. It's a custom of the Ashkenazim mentioned in certain, some of the sources in the Rishonim, medieval sources of the Ashkenazim. It's definitely a humrah to extend the period from the beginning of Av, which is up to 9 days, shall we say, and turn it into 3 weeks. That's definitely a humrah. That's adding many days of mourning practices or semi-mourning practices to the halachic curriculum. Did Chazal have this in mind? I am convinced they did not have such a thing in mind, and I will explain in one moment why. But the fact is, they did not discuss this. It was a local custom amongst the Ashkenazim, not amongst all Jews. It was not the case amongst the Sfaradim and the Temanim, for example. And playing music nowadays, having in the background, etc., as we discussed before, I'm not talking about going to a live concert or something like that. Going to a live concert or some sort of event where there's going to be live music, I would say that is something we should refrain from doing, certainly from Rosh Chodesh Av, the beginning of the month of Av, because that is a more happy, more uplifting experience and occasion. Listening to music on your car radio, what have you, is not an uplifting experience. It's just something that sort of passes the time and something that people are used to. So I have said to people over the years that you may listen to music up to Rosh Chodesh Av, up to the beginning of Av. And so during the 3 weeks, yes, but not during the month of Av, up till and after Tisha B'Av. Why do I say that? Why do I think and why do I claim that Chazal never intended a 3-week mourning period? First of all, mourning is a difficult thing. In other words, it's a negative reality. We all know that. I mean, it goes without saying. Mourning is always a negative reality. Now, if we're talking about mourning for a person who's just passed away, such as a parent, shall we say, then, which is something that almost everyone has to experience, it's a difficult, negative, heavy, demoralizing experience in many ways. And it's limited to a 7-day period of extreme mourning practices, or more serious mourning practices, a 30-day period of reduced mourning, shall we say. And with regards to parents and only parents, there's also an extension of that, again, reduced further to 12 months. But in general, mourning is not a healthy state of mind to be in. I do not believe that Chazal wished the Jewish people to spend many weeks and even, in fact, months of the year in a state of mind of mourning. Now, if you take the 3-week minhag of the Ashkenazim, if you add to that the 7-week period of the Sfirat HaOmer, which is a separate discussion, but it's also a kind of semi-mourning period, 7 weeks plus 3 weeks is 10 weeks. 10 weeks of the year is almost 20% of the year. To tell a person that you have to live nearly 20% of your year in a state of mind of mourning or semi-mourning, I think is psychologically damaging. I don't think it's healthy. I don't think it's right. I don't think, and that is why I think Chazal never instituted or even mentioned such a concept. Chazal did not mention anywhere the concept of mourning during Sefirat HaOmer for any period of time. They did not mention a 3-week period. They only spoke about from the beginning of Av until Tisha B'Av, which is much more limited in scope. And that is why I think that the Chazal, and you could also perhaps ask another question. Okay, so why did Chazal not institute any mourning period at all to do with the Bar Kokhba revolt, the quashing of which was a terrible, disastrous event, akin to what we refer to as the Holocaust or the Shoah. And I say this deliberately and knowingly. It was a terrible and disastrous event for the Jewish people in the long term. By the way, I do not like the term Shoah or Holocaust. I think both of those terms are imprecise and even misleading. It implies a kind of sudden natural disaster, as it were, something that just sort of happened, and we don't know how it happened or who did it.
What term would you prefer?
I prefer the term used by Shabtai ben Dov. You may not know who that is, and if you want to know, we can talk about that as well. But I prefer the term suggested by Shabtai ben Dov, Tevah Yudei Europa, which means simply the massacre, the mass murder of European Jewry. That is what happened, and that also tells you something about how it happened. It didn't happen by itself. It wasn't some natural disaster.
Was it a perfect storm, as they say?
It was not. It was a perfect storm in historical, sociological, and cultural terms, but it was perpetrated by people deliberately, with malice and forethought and bloodlust. It was not a great flood or earthquake or some such event that happened to bring about the demise of many, many people, which can also happen, but that's not what happened in Europe. What is it now? 80 years ago. So you could ask, why did Chazal not institute a mourning period which is in any way associated with the Bar Kokhba revolt and the eventual defeat and crushing of that revolt and the immense bloodletting that resulted? We're talking about 950 Jewish towns and villages being wiped off the map. This is according to historical sources. We're talking about hundreds of thousands, probably something like 400,000, maybe 500,000 Jews killed at that time, in those years of that revolt and the crushing of that revolt, and possibly an equal number, or at least a very significant number of Jews being sold into slavery. And comparatively, in terms of the size of the population at that time, we're talking about an immense calamity. So why did Chazal not institute a mourning period for that time? My answer to that question, which I've not seen asked anywhere, but I asked the question. I also have come up with what I consider to be a reasonable and rational and cogent halachic and Torah response, namely, Chazal intended that all forms of national mourning, there's a difference between the kind of mourning we mentioned earlier for a personal loss, a parent or a relative or what have you, and what we call national mourning. In Halakha we speak about Aveluth, regular mourning, and Aveluth Yeshana, old, so to speak, old, ancient mourning. In other words, the national mourning for events that took place in the past, which is serious, but not as serious as a fresh calamity or bereavement. Chazal intended, I believe, that all forms of national mourning, for whether it's for the Bar Kokhba revolt, for the Great Revolt, the year 70, the Minyanam, according to the Gregorian calendar, or the Christian calendar. There was no Gregory at that time. That was a later invention. The Gregorian calendar came into being in the 16th century. So that was the Julian calendar. They intended that all national calamities and tragedies be commemorated during the month of Av, in my view. That was except for the minor fast days. So you have the 17th of Tammuz, you have the 10th of Tevet, you have the 3rd of Tishrei, and you have Tisha B'Av. And that's it. That's what they spoke about. And I think they intended that there not be any further periods of mourning established in the Jewish calendar. That is how it seems to me.
Okay, so now I got to ask about Shabbatai ben Dov, you said?
Shabtai ben Dov.
Okay, can you tell us more about him?
Well, we could speak about Shabtai ben Dov for hours. But briefly, Shabtai ben Dov was born in Lithuania before the Second World War. He was born into a traditional but not entirely observant family, intellectual family. His family actually decided to come on Aliyah, move to Eretz Yisrael just before the war, the Second World War, and his father passed away shortly before they actually left Lithuania. So the father was buried there, and the mother and he and his brother came to Eretz Yisrael. They went to Tel Aviv shortly before the Second World War. I don't recall the exact year, but in the 30s, late 30s, I believe. And initially he describes in his brief autobiography, we have a set of his writings, which is over there on that shelf, 4 volumes, which is about 2,000 pages, and it's actually not all of his writings. He was very prolific, but it's not just prolific. We're not talking about someone who's just prolific. We're talking about someone who is I think, a world-class historical genius. Every page is heavy going, literally, to the extent that it's written in Hebrew, to the extent that an Israeli woman once said to me, familiar with these writings, she said to me, it has to be translated into Hebrew, because most Israelis can't get through it. I know this because I've heard many Israelis say this to me. I tried reading it, I got, did a page and a half, and I just couldn't do it anymore. It's really heavy going, okay? He describes how he came to Israel at that time, was before the state of Israel was established, and he sort of fitted into the general milieu of Tel Aviv society at that time for a few years, until he became about 14 or 15 years old, at which time he describes how he achieved some kind of self-awakening and realized how problematic the standard ideologies and ideas and approaches of people were. And in a nutshell, he became an active member of the Lehi, of the Lohamei Herot Yisrael, the organization referred to by the British, of course, as the Stern Gang, but referred to by the Jews who believed in that ideology as the freedom fighters for the Jewish people. He became an active member, and he was also swept up in a dragnet by the British at the age of 16, I think it was, and he spent, if I'm not mistaken, 6 years in Eritrea in a British jail, in a detention camp, and he was only released after the State of Israel was established. At that time, he began to study at Hebrew University. During those 6 years, by the way, he did not waste his time. In those 6 years, he managed to give himself an education that most people would not manage in 600 years. In other words, the British were probably happy, apparently were happy to supply him with as many books as he wanted, just keep him quiet and out of the way. And he just, absorbed books at a phenomenal rate. He studied philosophy and different systems of law. He became a lawyer eventually. And he studied law. But he was not an observant person at this time. He wasn't brought up fully observant. When he was released from jail and from that detention camp, he came to Israel. He fought briefly in the war known as the War of Independence. Whether that's a correct term is also a good question. Shabtai ben Dov again refuses to refer to it as Milchemet HaShichrur, which means the war to redeem the country from foreign occupation. He says that was not, and that wasn't actually the purpose of that war. That was a defensive war, essentially, to prevent the Arabs overrunning the nascent state. But he refers to Milchemet HaShichrur as what the Lehi and the Etzel were doing against the British. but that's another story. So he went to university, and at the age of 28 he describes how he got on a bus in Yerushalayim and he saw a little Haredi boy, 10-year-old boy or so, carrying a Gemara, a Talmud in his hand to get on the bus. And he said to himself, how can it be that this young boy can understand what it says in that tome, in that volume, and I don't? So what did he do? Being Shabtai ben Dov, he sat down and went through the entire Seder Nezikin, which is a whole difficult section of the Talmud, in 4 months. And he, in short order, he also became observant. He never fully identified with the religious crowd, the Mizrahi world or the Haredi world, but he became an observant Jew over a matter of a few years, I believe, at the most. And he studied Torah for the rest of his life. He actually worked in the employ of the government as a lawyer in the various ministries, but he spent most of his time writing. And we have the results. The results of that writing were published about, I think, less than 20 years ago by someone called Yuda Etzion, who did an amazing job of editing and publishing those writings. That's in a nutshell. But I have to add one or two more sentences. What exactly is Shabtai ben Dov all about? He is describing why, in the first place, why Zionism as an ideology is such a poor and impossible ideology on which to base any kind of national existence and future activity and direction for the Jewish people. And B, what the solution is. What does need to happen? In what kind of terms do we need to think, and what sort of things we need to do to eventually, one day, B'ezrat Hashem, have a Jewish state. It's quite clear, I imagine, to you and to the audience listening to us at this moment, that we do not have a Jewish state. We have a state of Jews, and even that's not true, and not entirely. We have a state where a majority of the population at this point is Jewish. The official figure is just over 70%. That's not true. The real figure is something more like 65%, which means that just under 2/3, certainly no more than 2/3 of the population at this moment in time in Israel is Jewish, halakhically Jewish.
I don't think most people realize that.
I'm sure that most people don't realize that, and that's a shocking but an entirely factual piece of information that we need to fully absorb and internalize. Again, the official figure is just over 70%. It was announced this year before Yom Ha'atzmaut, Israel's Independence Day, that for the first time the Jewish population dropped below 71%. I think they said it was 70.9%. As I told you, I don't think the figure is accurate. I think the real figure is several percentage points lower. No more than 2/3. That's an important thing to internalize.
Why would you say that it's 2/3?
Because the official figures do not take into account the fact that hundreds of thousands of immigrants who arrived here starting in the early 90s, according to the Gregorian calendar, starting in Tafshin Nun Aleph, and up to the present time, hundreds of thousands of those immigrants from the former Soviet Union are not Jewish. Many of them admit to this freely, and some of them, quite a large number in fact, arrived here with forged documents at that time. This is also well known to anyone who wishes to know it. I recall that the Sara Pnim, the Interior Minister, the Minister of the Interior, or the head of the Interior Ministry at that time was Rabbi Yitzchak Peretz. He was at that time the head of the Shas Party, which was a new phenomenon. He was also formerly the Rav of the Sfaradi Rav of Ra'anana. And I believe an honest and a sincere individual, and that's why I didn't last in politics very long, I believe. He, at the beginning of that wave of immigration, this massive wave of immigration, shortly after the former Soviet Union collapsed and people were able to leave, he went for himself to see what was going on, because he heard about all these rumors about all these people who were actually not Jewish, who were coming with forged documents that were forged, by the way, by former KGB experts in forgery. The KGB was the largest operation in the world in terms of forging documents. Now, when the KGB collapsed, what are these people supposed to do for a living? So they were happy to provide any kind of document you wanted for money, for hard cash. So if you needed supposedly some document that attested to your grandmother's marriage as a Jewish marriage or something like that, they could do that for you, and they did. Yitzhak Peretz went to Russia at that time to investigate, and I recall very well hearing him in the Israeli media in being interviewed and saying, I went, I checked, and I'm telling you without a doubt that at least 1/3 of those arriving now in Israel are not Jewish. Those were his words, not mine. You can look it up. People do not realize, I think, that today it's worse. It's not 1/3. It's at least half. The official figures now are that over half of the people arriving from the former Soviet Union today in Israel, under the so-called law of return, are not Jewish. And most of them do not want to be Jewish. Well, certainly not, they did not wish to be halachically Jewish. They did not wish to convert. They just wish to be what they are, which is essentially Russians. And they're the people who vote for a particular party. you may know to whom I refer. If you don't know, his last name begins with an L. All right?
Okay, this is the Ari Lewis Show. How many media outlets in Israel are going to report that, right? You're hearing the truth about these stats, so I hope everyone's appreciating that. I wanted to discuss another concept regarding customs, because there's also a custom of the week of Tisha B'Av. Some people have a custom where they just mourn for that week. Can you tell us where that comes from as well?
All right. I mentioned what the Mishnah states, that we begin to limit happy activities that somehow are associated with happiness, with rejoicing, merriment. We limit that from the beginning of the month of Av. The Mishnah goes on to state that the week of Tisha B'Av, the week in which Tisha B'Av falls, that week there are some added restrictions. What are those added restrictions? One of them is not to wear laundered, washed clothing. Another one is not to cut one's hair or trim one's beard. Those are the things, it says in the Mishnah, Osurim milesaper o milechabes. Those are the two things mentioned in the Mishnah. It says nothing in the Mishnah about what you may or may not eat during that week, or during those days leading up to Tisha B'Av. So it doesn't say anything about not eating meat or anything of the sort. It also happens to be the case, therefore, that if, as it happens this year, Tisha B'Av falls on a Sunday, there is no such week.
Right.
There's no week that precedes it. If it falls on a Thursday, Wednesday, Tuesday, whatever, then there's a few days leading up to Tisha B'Av. And so those restrictions of the Mishnah apply to those days, unless there are reasons which would cause us to claim otherwise, which we can discuss in a moment. But if it falls on a Sunday, there's no such practice. Bichlal, not at all. And that is the halacha and the custom amongst the Sfaradim. Amongst the Ashkenazim, already in medieval times, we find certain poskim who said, if it falls on a Sunday or Monday, then we add the week before. We do those practices the week before Tisha B'Av, as if it's the week of Tisha B'Av. The Mishnah goes on to say that there are restrictions as to what one can eat, but with reference only to the Su'uda Mafsaketh, the meal that one eats prior to the fast of Tisha B'Av, the last meal that one eats before the fast. There it says you do not drink wine, you do not eat meat. By the way, meat means red meat in the Mishnah and the Talmud. When it says basar, without any qualifying word, extra adjective or term, it means red meat. It does not mean poultry. This is also mentioned explicitly by certain Rishonim. It speaks about not eating shnei tavshilim, 2 cooked dishes. So one cooked dish. What's a cooked dish? You put, let's say, some lentils and some rice into a pot and you cook it. That's a tavshil. That's a cooked dish. Okay? You can't eat meat anyhow. So we're not talking about a stew with meat in it, but you can cook rice. You can have one such dish of cooked rice or lentils or anything of that nature, but you can't have 2. So it has to be a minimal meal, a bare bones meal,
Without, have to have an
without
egg
bones, without you don't have to have an egg. The idea of an egg has to do with a custom which is related to mourning. In other words, standard mourning bereavement, where an egg is offered to the mourners for various reasons that are given, but there's no requirement to eat a specific food. What the Mishnah discusses is not eating certain things. Again, red meat, 2 cooked dishes, drinking wine, etc. Okay. Now, many of these practices were extended in almost universally in almost all Jewish communities over time to apply to either the week of Tisha B'Av or from Rosh Chodesh, or from the beginning of the month of Av. So Rambam discusses, for example, that there are places where they do not do shehita. In those days, of course, meat was slaughtered and consumed almost immediately, though it could not be kept, right? There was no refrigeration. So he speaks about the fact that there are places where they don't have shehita, ritual slaughter, from Rosh Chodesh, and other places that don't do it from the week of Tisha B'Av, etc. These are all customs, these are all minhagim. I think these customs are fine, perfectly all right, and admirable even, commendable. But, as I said, I do not believe the minhag with reference to not eating meat was initially intended to cover poultry, which is not considered a particularly festive item. But if a person feels that, we usually have it for Shabbat, and therefore it is festive, and we're not going to do it, eat it for a few days or what have you before Tisha B'Av, okay, that's again a commendable practice. I don't think it's an actual hovah, not an obligation, but I think it's a commendable practice. There are, of course, many other things that one can eat, but the practice that I observe some people doing, which is going out to a fish or vegetarian restaurant during those days leading up to Tisha B'Av, that is definitely incorrect. That is to be discouraged. Going into any restaurant, going out to eat whatever, except perhaps for something simple like a pizza or something like that, or a falafel, anything like to go out somewhere to eat is not the right thing. Is not appropriate during these days.
Do some of these restaurants have the 9 days menu?
Right, they have a special 9 days menu, which is actually quite opulent and quite attractive, but that really defeats the purpose.
Let's talk about a concept. This actually has happened the last couple of years where the 9th of Av falls on Shabbat, so obviously don't fast on Shabbat, but there's this, probably an Ashkenaz custom to still have a type of mourning anyway. I want to know your thoughts about that. And also, there apparently is an opinion that it would actually be preferable if Tisha B'Av was on the 10th of Av, because that was actually a tougher day. We still saw the temple burn, etc. So give us your thoughts about that.
Well, the last point first. It is mentioned in the Talmud. It is discussed why was the 10th of Av not chosen as opposed to the 9th of Av, because much of the destruction, etc., took place on the 10th. But the conclusion of all the Hachamim, of all the Mishnah, and both Talmudim, the Bavli and the Yerushalmi, and all the sources, is that the fast was set for the 9th of Av, and that's when we are required to fast, not on the 10th. There are certain minor things that there are customs not to do on the 10th, such as not go and get one's get a haircut, for example, before midday on the 10th or something like that. Again, a commendable custom, but it's a minhag, not a chova. There are those who have a custom of not studying Torah because it's something which causes a person to be happy and uplifts a person. Studying Torah is not done, or most of the things that we usually study when we refer to Torah study, we do not study on Tisha B'Av. There are many things that you can still study because there are sufficient things in the Torah that do not make one happy. Now, you learn the book of Eov, which is not a very optimistic book.
Or things with the destruction.
Or things to do with the Churban, the Navi, Yirmiyahu, Jeremiah. Much of what he discusses is fairly heavy and not terribly joyous or uplifting in nature. So there are things that Chazal said we can learn on Tisha B'Av also. That Isur of studying Torah on Tisha B'Av refers to Tisha B'Av itself. There is a minhag some have of not studying Torah already in the afternoon preceding Tisha B'Av. It is, on the one hand, a well-known custom, but it's also a fact that many of the latter-day poskim, such as the Gra and others, such as the Gaon of Vilna and others, oppose this custom. That studying Torah is one of the most important and central and fundamental things that a Jew must and should always strive to do. And to add extra hours to the time when one does not study Torah is not something we need to do. It's enough that we act correctly according to Halacha on the day of Tisha B'Av. And I would agree with that position.
In regards to then when the 9th of Av is on Shabbat itself, right, there's some Ashkenazi customs to still have a little bit of mourning, correct?
The custom you refer to that custom refers only to certain very specific activities.
Okay.
But generally, when even those opinions agree that when the 9th of Av falls on Shabbat, we eat as usual. We have standard Shabbat meals as usual. We do not change. We're not allowed to fast to fast or to mourn on Shabbat, not in an obvious way. So that there is a discussion with regards to conjugal relations on Friday night, shall we say, if it happens to be Tisha B'Av. Again, the halakha is that there's no such prohibition. There's a minhag that discusses this possibility, but again, it's only a minhag, not something that Chazal instituted at all. When Tisha B'Av falls on Shabbat, the following day, which is the Sunday, the 10th of Av, is when we fast and mourn.
Okay, this is the Ari Lewis Show here on Israel Sports News Radio. Now, to clarify your position, you do hold that we should be fasting on Tisha B'Av. Some people might have a misnomer, but they should not. But we are in Israel. Part of the mourning process of Tisha B'Av is that we were kicked out of Israel. Of course, we don't have the temple. So should we view Tisha B'Av a little bit differently than when we were not in Israel?
It's a very good question. It will take a few moments to cover all the various aspects of that question. We have, as I mentioned earlier, 4 fast days during the year, not just Tisha B'Av. We have Shiva Sabat Tammuz, 3 weeks before Tisha B'Av. We have the 3rd of Tishrei, and we have the 10th of Tevet and Tisha B'Av. So that's four fast days related to national mourning. There is a sugya, a Talmudic discussion in Masechet Rosh Hashanah, which discusses all of these fast days. And briefly, the conclusion is as follows, that the 3 minor fast days, where we do not fast, the general practice is not to fast the full 24-hour fast, but only from dawn, the beginning of the day till the end of the day. So those other 3 fast days, Shiva Sabat Tammuz, Asara B'Tevet, Tzom Gedalia, those minor fast days are not always an obligation. Sometimes they are an optional fast, where a person can choose to fast or not, and sometimes they are obligatory, just as Tisha B'Av is obligatory. On what does this depend? It depends on the national circumstances of the Jewish people. What are the real world circumstances of the Jewish people in that particular generation? That is what the Sugya discusses. That is why we find in the Gaonic period, we're talking about, shall we say, the 8th, the 9th, the 10th centuries, we have more than one source from the Gaonim in Bavel, in Babylon, who state that the 3 fast days that I just mentioned, excluding Tisha B'Av, are optional and not obligatory. Tisha B'Av, they all state unequivocally that this is obligatory, a full 24-hour fast, and this remains the case until that which we focus on Tisha B'Av, which is Yerushalayim, the Mikdash, the temple, and everything related to that, essentially a normative Jewish state and reality as mandated by the Torah. Until that is once again a living reality, we are required to continue to fast on Tisha B'Av. Yes, I have heard of certain individuals, beginning many years ago in fact, who said to me, who asked me, who suggested or claimed that we don't need to fast in Tisha B'Av even nowadays because we're in Eretz Yisrael and we're a sovereign nation. Without going into all of that discussion in great length, that is a spurious claim. That is a misunderstanding of the sources. It is not true. We are required to fast on Tisha B'Av. With regards to the 3 minor fast days, as I said, in the time of the Geonim, when the situation in most of the Jewish world was reasonably good, not disastrous, the Jews were not being persecuted in most parts of the world at that time. Those 3 fast days, not Tisha B'Av, were optional, not obligatory. But then, starting in the 11th century with the First Crusade and other parts of the world, other events, the situation of many, if not most, of the Jewish communities around the world worsened considerably, and in fact continued to do so for many generations. So that we find the Ramban writes in his famous book Torat HaAdam, where he discusses these all issues to do with mourning. He says that today, because of our situation in most countries of the world, the situation is very dire, and therefore we are required to fast on all these fast days, all 4 fast days, and nothing here is optional. And there's no question that position wasn't 100% correct, and this is quoted by all the subsequent posakim, like the Tur and the Rosh, what have you. But it's true, I think, to point out that our situation today, which is very far from perfect or even satisfactory, is nevertheless many orders of magnitude better than the situation was for the Jewish people as a nation, and for individuals or communities, as things were in the medieval times, in the 11th century, 12th century, 13th, 14th, 15th, and even later. Keep in mind, we had a number of crusades. There were many persecutions of Jews in North Africa and in Spain. Why did Rambam Maimonides flee Spain? Because Jews were being persecuted in Spain. He fled. We had of course the Spanish Inquisition and the mass conversion of Jews in Portugal, and not to mention the massacres of Jews in much earlier times in places like England, the massacre of Jews in York, for example, and the expulsion of Jews from England and later from France. The Jewish world was in a constant state of calamity, and therefore in a constant state of mourning. And that is also one of the reasons why so many of these minhagim, or these customs, grew up, because the Jews felt very honestly and sincerely, and it's very easy to understand why they felt that it's legitimate and correct for us to mourn as much as possible, so to speak. In other words, we have every reason and every justification to be very severe on ourselves in terms of mourning practices, even adding certain customs, adding certain stringencies. So that was a very reasonable and almost inevitable and perfectly comprehensible reaction to those realities. Today, things are much better than they were then, shall we say 700 odd years ago. But I hasten to point out that our situation today is, I repeat, very, very far from satisfactory. Anyone who's willing to look at the facts and see what goes on in Israel today must reach the conclusion that we do not live in a Jewish state, rather in a state with a Jewish majority, yes, as I said before, but that's not the same as a Jewish state. In Hebrew, there's a big difference between Medinat HaYehudim and Medina Yehudit. Right, a Jewish state or a state of Jews. And not only do we not have a state of Jews, we have a state which is perhaps 2/3 Jewish. And things are not going in a positive direction. We also, as we speak today, Israel is governed by the first joint Arab-Jewish government. That's in fact what we have at this moment in time. That is in fact, and it should be viewed for what it is, a watershed event of the most negative kind, which only shows you, only serves to demonstrate how dire our situation really is. And therefore we have every reason, every possible reason. Of course there's no temple, etc., etc. So there's every reason and a full halachic obligation to fast on Tisha B'Av. With regards to the 3 minor fasts, I believe that they are halachically today to be defined as optional. A person who feels that they want to and is capable of fasting without too much difficulty, without causing themselves to sort of either not go to work or collapse in the middle of their work day or come down with a terrible headache or what have you. It's commendable to do so, but not everyone has to do so on those 3 minor fast days at the present time. That is my view.
It's interesting to bring it up because a lot of the laws that work in Israel regarding Chagim pay, and this is something I know from my work, is that they generally require a person to work before the Chagim and then the day after. And with Rosh Hashanah, of course, that means they're working on a fast day. And sometimes it is difficult to do your best when you're fasting, so it's an interesting concept to say that it'd be optional if it's going to affect a person's work output, etc. Regarding the population, I want to touch upon that because I was on one of the first birthright trips ever. This was back 2001, and they mentioned at the time that the Jewish population of Israel may not be the majority in Israel by 2020 or so, and I was thinking that's kind of laughable, but as you mentioned, approximately 65%. It sounds like you're concerned that maybe 10 years from now it could get less than 65%. Do you have that concern?
We all should be very concerned. And yes, of course I am concerned. In fact, I'm worried. It won't happen in 10 years. But over a much longer time scale, it could happen. If large numbers of our enemies are allowed to enter the country, and large numbers of non-Jewish immigrants are allowed to enter the country, over time this will further dilute the Jewish, even the demographic reality of Israel, and will also consequently result in a dilution of the Jewish content and character of the country. And therefore we all have all possible reasons for concern, and these are things that must be discussed and debated, and something must be done. The current trends are tremendously pernicious and detrimental to the Jewish people.
So again, not all the media outlets are going to cover that stance that we just discussed. So again, I hope everyone's appreciating this episode of the Our Lewis Show. My guest is Rabbi David Bar Chayim. Rabbi,
and I'm sorry to interrupt you. I reiterate, we are now living. Now it's just a month or so since the new government was installed. This is the first time that we have a government which is ostensibly majority Jewish and minority Arabs, but in practice, as we already see from what has gone on over the last couple of weeks, the people calling the shots, who are calling the tune in this government, are the extreme left and the Arab component of that government. We are talking about the first joint Jewish and Arab government in the state of Israel. That is something that should shock all of us into a new state of awareness. We are not in the same. We are not living now in the same reality as we were up to a month ago.
Going back to Tisha B'Av, because there's some interesting highlights that maybe some people aren't aware of. For example, we generally don't say Tachanun on Tisha B'Av, and there's a concept. I assume it's figurative. Maybe it's literal.
That's also a custom, by the way.
Okay.
All right, but go on.
But there's also a literal or figurative concept of Mashiach being born on Tisha B'Av. If you could elaborate where that comes from, what do you think that means?
There is such a statement in a midrash. What it means is something that one could debate and one could offer various explanations. The way I understand such a statement is as follows. It is by remembering and commemorating these events that took place in the distant past. And as I said, we are supposed to concentrate and focus all of our mourning for all the various calamities that befell the Jewish people from the time of the first temple and down to the present time. we are to focus and our attention and our attention span for mourning, as it were, during this time of the year. And this commemoration of these events, remembering and commemorating these events, is not simply so that we know that once upon a time such and such a thing occurred. That of course is important. We have to, if you don't know your history, then you're lost completely. If you don't know where you came from, then you have no idea where you might need to go towards what is your goal, what is your aim, what is your destiny. If you don't know where you came from, you can't possibly answer that question. So the Jewish people need to know what happened, yes. But the reason we fast on Tisha B'Av, the reason we mourn on the various days of the year, is not just to know or even just to commemorate what occurred in the past, but rather to force us to think about what's missing, what we do not have now, why therefore are we still fasting, why are we still mourning, and therefore what needs to be done so that we will no longer be in that position. It's also a kind of corrective. It is to direct our thoughts towards changing the reality, so that eventually all the fast days, as mentioned in that Talmudic discussion I mentioned earlier in Masechet Rosh Hashanah about the various fast days for reasons of national mourning, so that all those fast days, as mentioned in the Navi and the prophet Zechariah, will become days of national celebration. So the purpose of mourning and fasting is at the most fundamental level is about forcing us to focus and think about these things and be aware of what is missing, where we are today and where we need to get to, and how we're going to get from this point to that point, to be the Mamlechet Kohanim V'Roy Kadosh, the kingdom of priests and a holy nation as described in the Torah. How are we going to get, what do we need to do starting yesterday, not today, not tomorrow? What do we need to do to work towards that goal? That is the most fundamental reason and justification and therefore imperative that we remember, that we fast, that we mourn, in order that we focus on these things and think, how are we going to change these realities so that our children, our grandchildren, great-grandchildren will not need to do these things. That they will live in a different reality, and they will actually become days of national rejoicing, as explicitly mentioned in the prophet. So how do I understand the concept of Mashiach being born on that day? Because if we relate to these days and these mourning practices in such a way, it's those practices themselves that bring about the Geula, bring about the renaissance of the Jewish people and achieving our true destiny.
Again, this is the Ari Lewis Show here on Israel Sports News Radio. Want to kind of switch gears a bit, but a similar concept of practices that we had in the Galut and practices that we have now. And in particular, I understand there's a concept that at the times of the Galut, that a Jew should not call the police on another Jew under certain matters, partly because, let's say if it's under Roman government, who knows what could happen to the community. Does that apply nowadays, especially in particular of safety? You know, if Jews threaten another Jew, God forbid, are they allowed to call the police on that Jew? What would be the proper way to handle it?
If a Jew, are you referring...
Like threatens violence towards another Jew.
One Jew threatens another Jew with violence?
Can they call the police in Israel?
Yes,
okay.
Most definitely they can, and they should. However, because as things stand today, as we have been discussing over the last half an hour or an hour, I don't know how long we've been going.
Time flies, we're having fun.
Seeing that as things stand today in Israel, many things are looked at, are viewed, not through a Torah lens, not based on a Torah perspective, but on all kinds of foreign notions and ideologies and assumptions. Therefore, much, unfortunately, of what the police, the court system, etc., what they do is in opposition to the Torah, what the Torah would recommend or suggest or command in any given situation. So one does have to employ circumspection and intelligence before turning to authorities that do not function in accordance with the Torah.
But safety is obviously
If a
important.
person feels that their personal safety is being threatened by anybody, doesn't matter who the person is, Jew, non-Jew, whatever the situation, then yes, one should turn to the authorities and to prevent such a thing happening.
You're mentioning the concept of non-Jewish influences, and we were talking about the government a bit, and it's interesting that this government structure is not adherent to Israel or the Jewish people. It comes from England. Is that part of the problem?
Yes and no.
Yes, sir. Okay, go ahead. I mean, is that part of the problem?
Well, let me just point out the following. Here in this country, we have had 4 elections over the last less than 2.5 years, correct?
Yeah.
And I've lost count of the number of governments. In England, they did not have 4 elections in the last 2 years. What my point is that this is not the British system. This is not the British parliamentary system which exists in the UK, which exists in Australia, which exists in Canada, which exists in New Zealand, and perhaps 1 or 2 other places that I have forgotten. There, the electoral system is very different from what we have in Israel. The system we have in Israel is not just not based on any values or Torah concepts. It's also not a feasible, workable system. There is a professor of political science by the name of Paul Eidelberg, who has written extensively on this subject. He's a great expert in the field of political science. He wrote a book in the year 2000, as memory serves, according to the Gregorian calendar, again, Tafshin Samach, a book called Jewish Statesmanship, Lest Israel Fall. That is the name of the book. He wrote it in English. All his books were authored in English. It was also translated into Hebrew and to Russian. I have the book. I've read it more than once, and he demonstrates simply and plainly that in the entire so-called democratic world, and I say so-called because that is also something that needs to be discussed, is the world the same world in terms of electoral reform and electoral systems and electoral fraud and what have you, that I recall, shall we say, as a child, as a teenager, or as a young adult growing up in other parts of the world perhaps. It's not the same world in my view. But putting that aside, the system that exists in Israel does not exist in any of the other so-called democratic countries on the planet, except for Holland. And doesn't work there either, by the way, as he demonstrates. In other words, a multi-party system which results in many parties being elected, entering the Knesset or the parliament, which necessitates coalition governments, usually of factions or parties that have very different agendas. This means that you cannot achieve a government which has a clear, resolute policy and a clear direction. It's not possible. It doesn't work. So you're constantly in a state of political paralysis. That obviously is not a good idea. So the system that we have here took some aspects of the British system and removed other aspects of it, replaced them with something vastly inferior, and that is why governance in this country has always been a very, very sad tale, very sad tale. Even in the first years of the state, there was no such thing as one party that gained a majority that allowed it to govern according to its notions and ideologies and stated positions. There were always coalitions. This is even in the heyday of Ben Gurion, shall we say. Today, it's totally unworkable. The system is unworkable. The fact that we did not arrive at such a situation early in Israel's history of having successive elections every half a year, over a 2-year period, that itself is a miracle, because it could easily have occurred earlier, and if things don't change, it'll probably happen again.
This is the Ari Lewis Show here on Israel Sports News Radio. Last question for you. This isn't about Tisha B'Av or elections, more personal question in nature, because I have a really good friend of mine. He's one of my best friends, and he has a custom to go to Uman for Rosh Hashanah. I think he's done it every 10 years in a row. I think he asked me to do it 8 years in a row, and after the 8th year, he stopped asking me. I know you're not the biggest fan of that custom. If you could explain to my friend and the audience watching why you don't like that custom so much.
The idea of traveling to Uman, to the grave of Rabbi Nachman Breslov, a great spiritual mentor and teacher in my view, although I'm not a Breslover by any stretch of the imagination, but I think studying some of his writings can be of immense value. The idea of visiting his grave, and specifically on Rosh Hashanah, was something that Rabbi Nachman Breslov himself suggested to his Hasidim in the Ukraine at that time, the early 19th century, in order that there would be a time and a place every year where all his very few, one must say, there were very few Hasidim during his lifetime. Breslov Hasidut was perhaps the smallest of all the Hasidic groups or sects, with the smallest following, and they were looked at askance by almost the entire Hasidic world, not to mention the rest of the Jewish world. He wanted them to have some focal point to which they could come once a year, meet each other, spend some time with each other, and he suggested they come to his grave on Rosh Hashanah once a year. He also at the same time stated explicitly, quoting the pasuk in the Torah, "Dor revi'i yashuvu hena," which means the fourth generation from now should leave, should go. And what is that? What is he? And he explained what he meant. He said, 4 generations from now, I want you all to go to Eretz Yisrael. He said so. This is well known. I'm not making anything up. You can check everything I'm saying. It appears in official Breslov literature. He said, 4 generations from my time now, I want you all to go to Eretz Yisrael. We all know that towards the end of the 19th century, according to the Gregorian calendar, again, in other words, about 140 odd years ago, some of his Hasidim did exactly that, and they established the Breslov Bet Midrash and community in Mea Shearim in Yerushalayim, which exists to this day. And they even brought his chair, the famous chair in which he sat, and even some articles of clothing, a hat, etc. And you can see them, they can be viewed today in that Bet Midrash in Mea Shearim that was established by those of his Hasidim who actually took him at his word and came here. And they, of course, did not perish in the great bloodletting, the massacre of the Jewish people in Europe some 60 odd years later. All other Breslov Hasidim, which was the majority, the vast majority, who remained in the Ukraine, they were almost all of them in the Ukraine, almost to a man were murdered. Almost none survived. Breslov Hasidut was particularly hard hit by those events. The fact that today is so much better known, and the writings and some of the ideas of Rabbi Nachman Breslov are discussed more broadly, that itself is a miraculous development and a very interesting one, which needs to be discussed on another occasion. But yes, it certainly has rebounded. But almost all of Breslov Hasidut was destroyed at that time in the Second World War. And only those who came to Yerushalayim, took the Rebbe at his word, survived, and they formed the seed from which everything has developed since that time, down to the present. Rabbi Nachman's suggestion, therefore, was not that Jews continue to travel to Uman for all eternity and visit his grave on Rosh Hashanah. He's explicitly stated that it should not be so. And again, there are books written by some of the leading Breslov Hasidim over the last 50 years making this point and stating that in fact some of them suggested that bringing Rabbi Nachman Breslov's grave, relocating it here to Israel, that was stymied for the simple reason that too many people are making a lot of money from this ongoing tourism to Uman. But that's what should happen. And I hope one day it will happen. The idea of continuing to visit that country, Ukraine, which is soaked in Jewish blood, against the wishes of Rabbi Nachman Breslov, as understood by some of the leading Hasidim of Breslov Hasidut, and as has been described in some books written by these people that I've seen. The idea that people continue to go to Uman and on Rosh Hashanah to visit his grave, etc., I think is an immense aberration. Not at all something that can be reconciled with standard halachic Torah Judaism, and it also cannot be said to be the intention of Rabbi Nachman Breslov. So I think it's a very unfortunate practice.
All right. Well, you heard it. So this has again been another episode of the Ari Lewis Show here on Israel Sports News Radio. If YouTube does not take this episode down, it'll be on the Nation of Israel YouTube page. Rabbi Mark Chayim, thank you for being on. He's the founder and head of the Shiloh Institute. And I hope everyone's enjoyed this program. Again, we're going to leave the comment section open. If you didn't like my questions, didn't like the answers, you can write, but try to be respectful, please. Thank you, everyone, for watching. God bless, and good night. I hope everyone has enjoyed this episode of the Ari Lewis Show. I want to give a special shout out to my friend Shmuel, who has helped me in a lot of ways. Thanks, homie.